Okay, so here we are with the IamReverb plugin. Now, I think this is really worth a look because it's bringing something new to the table, and that's not easy to do these days. There are so many reverb plugins out there, and when you've got things at the level of Liquid Sonics, Cinematic Rooms, and Seventh Heaven, and Tai Chi, and so forth, it's very difficult for a new player in the reverb market to come up with something that matches those, and even if it does, that brings something new to the table. Obviously, if you're looking at reverbs that go outside of just creating space and are creating interesting special effects, then yes, there's all kinds of new interesting stuff. But in terms of the bread and butter reverbs for a mix, it's really pretty tricky to come up with something that, you know, isn't already covered by some already brilliant reverbs. But this one really does bring something new to the table. Creating these videos takes significant time and effort. Supporters of the channel make it possible for me to continue to make more. If you find these videos useful and interesting, I invite you to support the channel. There are a range of things you can do. You can make a direct donation of any amount, become a monthly patron, buy some of my music, or buy some merchandise. I also have a range of courses available that cover all essential aspects of mixing, from getting started right up to advanced techniques. Links to everything are in the video description below. And finally, click that like and subscribe button. Thanks. I'll go over the controls, but I'll first just explain what makes this different. It's an impulse response reverb. In other words, it's not algorithmic. It is semi-algorithmic in the sense that you can change a lot about the impulse, how the impulse responses work, but it's based on impulse responses. So, in other words, it's not just an impulse response player. It's way, way more than that. So, and I don't know what they're doing under the hood here, but it's very impressive. So impulse responses mean that they have recorded something from a real space. Algorithmic reverbs, pure algorithmic reverbs, it's all done digitally. It's all done creating thousands and thousands of little reflections and things in myriad different ways. But impulse responses, somebody has gone to an actual space, like a concert hall or a cathedral or whatever it is they want to capture. They play a sound, usually a sweep, audio sweep, through the frequencies, through some very good speakers. They have microphones set up in the hall at various distances away from those speakers, and they record that sweep sound. And with that recording comes the sound of the room mixed in with it, and then you can remove the sweep using software, and what you're left over with is a file, an audio file that contains the reverb information without the actual sine sweep. And that can be used to recreate that reverb sound on anything you put through it. And that's basically, you know, in a very rough form, that's what impulse response reverbs do and how they roughly work. They've been around for a long time, but in more recent times, there have been some very sophisticated manipulations of this technology. Liquid Sonics have been doing it for a while, where they're able to somehow morph lots of different impulse responses from hardware that they've been sourced from hardware, so that you can change the knobs and dials on the plugin, and it does the same thing as it would happen if you changed them on the hardware. And my understanding is, without really knowing the details, is that they've done many, many impulse responses with the knobs at different positions, and then they morph from one to the next. Now, I don't know whether IamReverb is using that same technology. Probably they've got something of their own, but what you can do here, and this is not the main bit here, this is just a very useful, interesting element to the plugin, is that you can change the decay and the size. And you can do this on some other reverbs that are impulse response reverbs, but what's different about this is they sound really great. Even if you change the decay way down, much smaller than the original, still sounds really realistic. Or much longer, still sounds really realistic. And this is what I find is generally, in many of them, lacking. When you change the decay too much, when you change the size too much away from the original, it starts to sound a bit weird. Because the audio file that was created in the space is messed with too much. It's time stretched or compressed or whatever they do behind the scenes, and you start to hear artifacts. Well, with this one, I'm just not hearing those artifacts. It's sounding very, very realistic, and I do not know how they've done that, and this is why I'm calling it sort of semi-algorithmic, because it seems like they've somehow got down very deep into how impulse response technology works, and they're able to manipulate it in such a way that, you know, sounds very convincing. So that's the first thing that, to my ears, makes this sound a lot different from most impulse response reverbs. Again, there are others that do this, like Liquid Sonics, but most of them, to my ears, don't manage to do this, and this one does it incredibly convincingly. So, but that's not the main attraction here. The main thing, this really difference that this brings to the table, is that it's got this close, mid, and far control here. The rest, and I'll look at that in just a second, the rest are all pretty straightforward: an input and output, pre-delay, width, wet and dry. Nice little touch here is they've separated the wet and dry away from the presets. Fantastic, because on a reverb, I almost never have it as an insert. It's almost always on a, you know, on a effects send, and I think that's how most people use it. So it really makes sense to do that. It's also got an EQ here, which is like a standard EQ, parametric EQ. Great, very useful to have. It's in a separate page, which makes sense. So now let's look at the sort of main thing here, which is the close, mid, and far. Now, what they've done here is they have recorded that impulse response I was talking about in, say, you know, a concert hall. They recorded it really close to the source, so the microphones have been set close to the speaker that's playing the sound, the sine sweep, whatever they use. They've got some that are further away, some mics set up further away, and they've got some set way far back, I'm guessing at the back of the hall, maybe quite high up. I'm not sure where they placed them, but like really picking up the far sound of as if you're way at the back of the hall. And you can mix this to taste, and it really sets this one apart. It's kind of equivalent to some of the reverbs like Inspirata and the Vienna one, where you can move the kind of mic position around yourself on a kind of graphic of the hall. But it's not quite the same as those, but it achieves the same thing. Like, I don't know if it's using the same technology as those, but it's different because you can turn all of them up if you want. So, you know, you can turn the close-up at the same time as the far, which isn't the case with those ones where you're moving the kind of source around. And it means you can blend a really just exactly the kind of sound you want. I find it really, really useful, as we'll hear. And it really is great for positioning an instrument. I find it incredibly effective for positioning an instrument further or closer and creating the sound of the hall being bigger or further back. All of those kind of 3D manipulations I find really easy to work with this reverb. And because it's based on impulse responses, and because it's incredibly well recorded, incredibly well implemented, it really sounds real. Like there's a real sense of space that you can hear moving right back behind the speakers. So that's impressive, because that's, I think, maybe the hardest thing to create in a reverb, is that real sense of space. So we'll have a listen to all of this on a couple of different sources. The last thing I'll mention is it's got this inverse button here, and that inverses the phase of the far knob here, that impulse response far back at the hall. And that is actually, I find really useful. When I first read about it, I thought, well, I'm not really going to find it useful, but actually it is really useful. If you have a source which is maybe panned or sounding like, once you brought in the far, a little too much on one side, and you know, the reverb sounding too much on one side of the mix, you flip this over and it spreads it out, and you really hear it fully in the back of the hall. Really does a nice job of that in the mix. Really a useful button to have. So let's now move over to listening to some sources. I'm going to start with Snare, and if I mute the reverb, you'll see here, this is the reverb, so I'm going to just mute it or not mute it. Start without it, so you'll just hear the snare in the context of the drum kit without the reverb. And as you heard, I brought the reverb in partway through, and I think you should be able to hear just what a sense of depth that is creating. And if you're on headphones, you may not hear this 3D thing. But I can tell you, if you've got a good pair of speakers, you can really hear it. You can almost like measure the distance back to the back of the room, which to me is the mark of a really great reverb. And it's the thing I think is the hardest thing to do in a reverb, is to really create that sense of depth so that I can see, I can tell you how deep this hall is. You know, it's really like you can almost see it out there back behind the speakers. And yeah, this is fantastic at that. Just a little bit about the presets. They are organized by different types. And if you choose one like a hall, you can then choose sort of subcategories of those halls, I guess, recorded in different places. Once you've gone to a user preset, you can no longer see what the source of that was. Now, I think one thing that would be really nice, and this is a tiny request because this is such a great reverb that I don't really have any criticisms of it, but it would be really great to be able to see, once you've made a user preset, which algorithm, which impulse response this is based on. Just would be handy, but not a big deal at all. So let's mess about with these controls now so you can hear what happens if I start to move, particularly these close, mid, and far. Okay, so I'm going to start with that first one, I think, because they're right in the middle, that first preset. So you can hear just how much variation you've got there. It's the same basic hall, the same space that you're in, but you're really changing the sound of it and where you're positioned in it. And although at the beginning I just did them one at a time, I actually almost always prefer to have at least some of the ones that I'm not emphasizing there. So if I want the far to emphasize the far, I generally find I like the sound of at least some amount of close and mid there. Sounds to me, generally what I like. But your taste may vary. Oh, and there's one thing actually that I'll just mention that they emphasize in their blurbs and things, and that is that they found this new way of recording impulse responses they've developed, which is proprietary. They're not telling you how they've done it for obvious reasons, where they've managed to record the early reflections separately. And apparently this is really difficult to do, and up till now hasn't really been possible to do with recording impulse responses. The early reflections get completely mixed in with the overall late tail of the reverb. And that means that the early reflections, when you're using as an impulse response, don't really have as realistic an effect as they would do if you were actually there. And having them separate, as you would in an algorithmic reverb, allows a more realistic sense of space and the space of the size. And that they've managed to find a way to do that, so that they've actually been able to record those early reflections separately from the tail of the reverb. And that's what they're saying is what gives it this real sense of 3D-ness. And I have to say, it's interesting because the Precocity M7 reverb similarly emphasizes those early reflections. Apparently, an enormous chunk of the processor in the M7 is devoted just to the early reflections. And with a lot of algorithmic reverbs, those early reflections are really just a bunch of quick echoes, and there's nothing that special about them. And in the M7, I think the reason it sounds so realistic, and talking to Casey via email, as I have done, about some of the things that make that reverb sound so great, it is because they put an enormous amount of processing power into the early part of the reverb. They don't actually call them early reflections. He doesn't call them early reflections. He calls them the early part of the reverb, but it includes those early reflections, because that seems to be what a huge amount of what actually gives you that sense of 3D space. You'd think it was the tail, but actually it seems like those early part of the reverb, or the early reflections, is in fact a big component to what makes the thing sound 3D. So they've done a similar thing with this, is they've really put a lot into that, recording that in a very clear and separate way. And I think that's what the magic, part of the magic behind this is. Isn't just these three knobs, it's that as well. So there's a lot going for this plugin. You've got these three, which are unique. You've got that special way of recording the impulse responses, which gives it that real 3D thing. And you've got extremely sophisticated algorithms in terms of decay and size. And I'll just demonstrate that now. I'm just going to play around with the decay and the size on this. So, very convincing. You don't hear artifacts. The tail is very smooth, even when you've gone way, beyond the. Presumably, when you have this in the center, that's the original recording of the impulse response of the hall, and then when you've done this, when you're doing this, you're kind of changing that algorithmically. So they've done an amazing job of this. I mean, it sounds so smooth and very realistic sounding. So I'm going to try some other, here's another preset which I made, and let's have a listen to this one. So that one's really nicely bringing out the tone of the snare, the ring of the snare, which I like, especially with a snare like this where the ring of this snare is pretty muted. And I like a bit of a ring on a snare if it's well tuned, which this one is. And bringing that out is nice. Let's try this one here. So I've called that snare punch room because it really brings out that punchy low end of the snare. And it's just, I haven't got any EQ going on here, is why I showed this page. It's just the natural quality of the space. And as you can see, I've increased the decay a little bit, but I haven't gone way off from the original. It just has some fantastic spaces recorded in it. Really, really usable. Every one of them is incredibly usable. And again, I'm not going to mention any names, but some of the other reverbs out there that use impulse responses and allow like a lot of manipulation like this, not all the spaces are that usable. And I sometimes find myself struggling to find one which really sounds good in the mix. And this one, just every single one of them sounds great in a mix. They all are just totally usable, which is always what I found a bit lacking in these kind of impulse response reverbs. This one's, you know, it's almost as if you're working with an algorithmic reverb, in the sense that a really great algorithmic reverb like Seventh Heaven or Cinematic Rooms, like everything works in a mix. Every single preset, every single algorithm works really nicely in a mix. They just give you different characteristics. Whereas with a lot of impulse response ones, you spend half your time searching around for something that just works in the mix. Even though they might sound great, you know, it's a struggle to necessarily find a good fit. This one, you know, everything seems to just work really nicely, which is again another really impressive aspect to this. Immediately sounds good in a mix. Let's see what else we've got here. Let's try a very long haul just to hear that. Actually, we'll do this one and I'll move on to a different source. I mean, that's such a realistic sounding haul. I can see exactly how far that goes. And in my studio, I've got my monitors in front of me, a bit of a distance away from me, and behind those monitors, I've got a window set a reasonable distance back. I've got a window, and I can see out of the window to, you know, a green space with trees and so forth. And that back of the hall is a good way back into the green. I could just see exactly how far back it is, and to me that is unusual for a reverb to be able to do that degree of 3D-ness. So yeah, very impressive. Okay, so let's move over now to a different instrument. Let's listen to horn. So I'm just going to open up a different instance of this that's on the horn. I'm going to solo the horn up here and have a listen to this. So I'm going to what's the time on this? Come on here. 25:06. So I'll start with out the reverb, and then I'll bring it in. Beautiful sounding reverb for a horn. I'll start messing with some of the controls now, just so you can hear what they sound like. So you can really hear how moving these around moves the horn further and back. When I had the close-up high, the horn sounds like it's, maybe, 10 feet, or not 10 feet, 10 meters maybe in front of you, or maybe closer. And then when you turn the far up, it's like it's back in the hall, or you're further back in the hall. So really amazing set of controls here. And I find that just by moving these around, you just quickly find that sweet spot for what you're looking for in terms of in the context of the mix, where it wants to sit further or backwards, and how the sense of space is being created behind the instrument. Yeah, and in conjunction with the pre-delay as well, that can be a really quick and easy way to position an instrument in a way that most reverbs just can't even get close to, in my experience. So I'll just play about a little bit more with this and change the decay and the size a bit as well. So again, ultra realistic sounding. This really just sounds like a real hall, even when I'm moving these well out of their default positions. And the ability to move these around is fantastic. So let's try another algorithm here. Let's try this one. Okay, so let's now have a listen to this in context. I'll start without reverb and then I'll bring it in. So I think that was a pretty good demonstration of just how amazing this thing is at creating that 3D space and the sense of where that instrument is. As I turned up the close, it really feels like it's closer. You can hear it's nearer to you in the sound stage, and as you pull that down and bring up the far, you can hear it's way back there. So fantastic piece of work they've done on this reverb. I also really like the interface. It's nice to have something that's not pretending to be a piece of hardware, that's just clear and uncluttered. It's very easy to use. The EQ is just very quick and easy to use. You know, it's very well implemented. Yeah, fantastic. So the whole interface is really well done, I think. But the main thing here is the sound, and I have to say I think this sounds fantastic. Really brings some really new and very welcome new things to the mixing table here. I'm certainly going to be using this a lot, and that's saying a lot because the competition for this is steep. For me, it was basically Seventh Heaven in cinematic rooms are kind of like 90% sit there on my reverb buses because they're just so great, and I occasionally move to another one for certain purposes. This one's going to sit there with those two. It sounds that good to me. So yeah, fantastic reverb and highly recommended. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, please do like the video, subscribe, and if you can support the channel by pressing the thanks button, that's fantastic. And hope to see you next time.